O Son of Spirit, the best beloved of all things in my sight is justice. Turn not away therefrom if thou desirest me, and neglect it not that I may confide in thee. By its aid thou shalt see with thine own eyes, and not through the eyes of others, and shalt know of thine own knowledge, and not through the knowledge of thy neighbor. Ponder this in thy heart, how it behooveth thee to be. Verily, justice is my gift to thee, and the sign of my loving kindness. Set it then before thine eyes. Baha'u'llah. Well, welcome, dear friends. My name is Ehsan Bayat, and for about 6 months now, I have served alongside with Hoda Hosseini as a co-administrator for the Iranian Baha'is for Racial Justice Facebook page, and that is where we're live streaming right now. And here today to address the most vital and challenging issue facing our country, namely racial prejudice. It is a privilege and honor to introduce Mr. Bob Henderson. Mr. Bob Henderson is a 26-year veteran of the police force. His unique insight and experience, coupled with an unquenchable thirst for knowledge and passion to educate, is invaluable in our quest for racial equity. Ladies and gentlemen, Bob Henderson.
Thank you, Ehsan, for that. And thank you, Hoda, for the two of you creating this space. And I am so pleased to be here at a special time, a particular time in history where some say we're at an inflection point, a turning point, a tipping point. And so there's this kind of a unique time we live in, and people are just struggling to find answers to what's happening, particularly within the criminal justice system, and more particularly with what's specifically happening with law enforcement. And being a former member of law enforcement, I have some particular insights I'd like to share with you. And so the purpose of today is twofold. The purpose is to have a deeper and a better understanding of what's actually happening. So understanding is key. And the second part of that is healing. So the purpose of that today is understanding and healing. You know, many of you have been following the George Floyd trial, of course, right? And so we had to sort of be re-traumatized each time, you know, they show that 9 minutes, 29 second video. So there's a lot of pain. Now, understanding and healing is, in order for that to happen, it all starts with justice. And the purpose of justice, from my understanding, the purpose of it, the end result of justice should be unity. I wanted to, as part of the healing process, I wanted to just reflect a bit on the what happened with George Floyd on May 25th of 2020. And just take it back to that moment and connect with that moment. And I wanted to just sit and rest on this moment to allow us to just to connect with the humanity of the moment. I was, you know, whenever anything tragic happens, and, you know, you can just look at the tragedy, but then there's also a beauty in tragedy. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. What I was most touched by is the citizens that responded to the plea of George Floyd, who was being tortured on the ground, right? And so these wonderful souls who did not just ignore, who were not apathetic to the suffering of someone. I was particularly touched by Donald Williams, you know, the MMA fighter, who was saying, "What are you doing? You know, all I need you to do is just get off his neck." Just, you know, when he kept pleading in a very intense manner. So when I look at that, I see a couple of things, and this is what makes a very, very powerful moment for me. I see myself in George Floyd. Why? Because I'm also African American, as you can see. So I see it as a reflection, a mirror reflected back at me, and I see myself being tortured in the same manner. At the same time, I also, ironically, I see myself as Derek Chauvin. Why do I say that? I worked in law enforcement for 26 years, and we have a brotherhood. And when you see your brothers, misbehaving, then I take full ownership for that conduct, for that misconduct. And I wanted to say, whenever there's been a wrong, there needs to be a reckoning. There needs to be an honest, deep, sincere, and heartfelt apology. As law enforcement, we're supposed to stand up to justice. We're supposed to be the arms, the legs, the eyes, the feet of justice. But when justice turns to injustice, then we got another thing. So this is a very interesting time to live in. And I just want to just tell you, on behalf of my brothers and sisters who have, many of them, historically for 4 centuries, starting from slave patrols, going way back. It's been a tragic history. It's been a history of injustice, not the enforcement of justice. And so how do we understand what's currently happening? And I really strongly believe we can only understand it by not looking forward, because we're going to be very disoriented, not knowing where we are in time and trying to move forward. Right? We have to understand by looking back. And so what I would like to do, for the sake of time, I don't have as much time as I had in previous meetings, is to walk you through some of the history in our country in relationship to racism. And the way I'd like to do this is I want to do it in a poetic format. And so to get started in that, I'd like to share my screen with you. And we're going to take it from there. And again, for those who just showed up, today is about understanding and healing. In order to have that healing, we have to have justice. So let me share my screen. Do the technical things first. Okay, so I want to start off with, I wrote something, it's more in a poetic format, and there's kind of a preamble to the actual poem, which I want to share with you. And I call this Journey with Me, My Enslavers. Before you could know me, you must first feel me. For my true reality doesn't exist in your head. The head is for calculations, reasoning, rationaling, trying to decide between 2 favorite brands. Let us meet in a different place. A place where there is silence between the notes. A place that generates a genuine smile, not that half-hearted sneer that says my blackness makes you feel a bit uncomfortable. A place that says, I see you, brother. I see you, sister. I see we are all one and the same, and there's only the hue of a good character. Now, let's take that 1,000-mile journey together between your synapses and your heart. Turn inward and don't look back. It might be dark and scary at first, but then you'll see the light of truth and acknowledge the wreckage you caused. You'll be guided by a different source. Never mind this chatter in the background. That's just your mind worried it might miss its cortisol fix. You will never get there without a leap of faith. Beyond the hollowness of darkness is the light of God's grace. Take the leap. Take it. Down below is your heart welcoming you back home. But there is now a reckoning, my friend. For while you were gone, your frigidness of soul has caused a great deal of sorrow in its wake. Come see what you have done. The only path to justice, forgiveness, and healing is looking back, not forward. Tell our story, brother, of a broken and forgotten history. Collect our bones, the salt of countless tears, our pain from shattered families, and the countless blows from the master's cowhide whip. Tell of our motherland that was plundered, pillaged, and raped for 500 years through colonization. Tell of those who were conquered, kidnapped, shackled, sold, and dehumanized, while our life-giving vessels were divided like prey, giving sway to the barbarity of human depravity. Tell our story, brother, of our perilous journey across the Atlantic Sea from 1502 to 1867, where 12.5 million were reduced to human cargo, the largest forced migration the world has ever seen. Tell of the tight rows we were placed in the heartless metal of a bruising ship where we slept, wept, ate slop, took sick, vomited, sat on our waist, gave birth, died, and plotted our imaginary relief. Tell of the 1.8 million of our deceased, rebellious and the ill, who were tossed overboard through the howling winds of separation and became scraps while being ripped apart bit by bit by the hyenas at sea. Tell our story, brother, of our arrival in a strange and distant land, being lined up, paraded about, and sold like an animal or a piece of property on an auction block. Tell our story, brother, of the morn of separation, with our outstretched hands, pleading in vain in a broken stance. Tell of the horrors of labor camps, where we toiled from sunup till sundown while under the gun and that dreaded cowhide whip. Tell of those who ran with shackled feet, who were caught by the master's hounds and paraded and beat into a bloody morass, the cure for the fabrication of drapetomania. Tell our story, brother, of an institution of pain, brutality, and suffering, where killing an African was legally justified in the Cajun Killing Act of 1669. Tell our story, brother, of those mental candles which were never lit, for to embrace a book was punishable by death. Tell of the Revolutionary War, spurred by the words of the founding fathers who exclaimed, "Give me liberty or give me death," while another echoed, "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, while themselves being bent over the yoke of oppression and injustice." Tell of the Civil War where 644,000 died for perjuring the documents of liberty as divine chastisement for making cotton their lord. Tell of the 13th Amendment and the abolishment of slavery, except for Black skin, which made one a duly convicted criminal. Tell of Black codes, convict leasing, debt servitude, and sharecropping, which continued slavery for 80 more years to rebuild the entire crumbled South in the aftermath of the civil strife, while under new names and trumped up charges. Tell of the hard and brutal labor from our blood and backs, which rebuilt the South from brickyards, farms, turpentine camps, coal mines, lumber yards, roads, and forests, which were split inch by inch for railroad tracks. Tell of the era of Reconstruction where freedom rang with the 14th Amendment, giving everyone citizenship as a natural birthright, and the 15th Amendment giving all men the right to vote, which led to biracial governments and the education of our children and youth in public schools for the very first time. Yet, despite these changes, tell of the federal troops abandoning their southern posts, which led to segregation and the sunken moat of injustice as white resistance rudely uprooted those fledgling biracial governments. Tell of lynching as a public spectacle and as a show of terror and social force, and poll taxes and literacy tests, which kept us from the voting booth. Reconstruction's final curtain call. Tell of the NAACP, which overturned Plessy versus Ferguson in the landmark decision of Brown versus the Board of Education, which made segregation in schools unconstitutional. Then tell of the response to the Brown versus Board of Education case as 101 congressmen and senators signed the Southern Manifesto, vowing massive resistance to the Supreme Court decision and its complete overthrow. This was time of the US government's fixation to compete with the Soviet Union in a global space war. Therefore, school desegregation and its full implementation was placed in the back burner of our nation's priorities. Tell of our mass exodus out of the South to the northern cities where ancestors fled as refugees from terror and not as mere citizens seeking merely job opportunities. Now, tell of our inner cities as the great wall of oppression from scars that never healed. Tell of the proliferation of poverty, gangs, and the dissemination of illicit drugs, where Black on Black crime astounds, where self-loathing and internalized hatred shatters the mirror of self-reflection, where school segregation still shackles the mind from Los Angeles, California, New York City to Little Rock, Arkansas, creating a school to prison pipeline, and where the federal government, through the aftermath of redlining and the historical denial of equal opportunities, created a self-fulfilling prophecy. Tell of the heroes and heroines of the Civil Rights Movement, which produced the Civil Rights Act and the Welfare Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Then tell of the pushback in the Southern political strategy to get tough on crime in the 1970s, which became a literal war by the 1980s with the war on drugs and crack cocaine, which led to mandatory sentencing, militarized policing in our inner cities, and once again, the separation of our families for life under the three strikes laws by the 1990s. Consequently, with a felony record, one is barred from the voting booth, financial aid, housing, and student loans. So for many Black folks, the gains from the Civil Rights Movement went up in smoke. Tell of the privatization of America's prisons, with majority of its inmates are Black and Latino from those poor inner cities who are forced to work for less than minimum wage or no wage at all, while private companies make millions through quotas from the sweat and brow of prison labor. This is mass incarceration, just another iteration of oppression and slavery while hidden in plain sight. Tell of the ongoing struggle where unarmed Black men whose skin invokes fear and the word criminal are being shot by police while driving away in their cars during a foot chase with their backs fully exposed, whether prone or supine or standing with both arms completely stretched out. After all, don't Black lives matter? Tell of the fog of confusion and colorblind racism as injustice has embedded itself, creating disparities in every institution. For without an obvious perpetrator and folks blind to historical power and privilege, some state with an impetuous distaste, you got your civil rights and had a Black president. Everything is okay, right? Now, let me speak with the light of God's truth. that behind the hue, we have always been one people, which all the modern day human sciences confirm, and that racial categorizing has always been a social construct to keep power in the hands of a mere few. Therefore, divine education, brotherhood, and love is the only true way the human heart and mind can set itself free from the dark illusions of prejudice and internalized hate, and into the light of unity and oneness, so that we all can breathe free. So that we all can breathe free. So we all can breathe free. Now, thanks for bearing with me and listening through the history. Again, I don't have time to go through the details because of our time, but I hope you got a sense of one particular thing that with this issue of racism rather, because it's never been fully cured, we see just different iterations of it occurring. And I want to share with you just a few sentences from I'm a member of the Baha'i faith, and there are made administrative bodies called the Universal House of Justice. And they commented on the issue of race in our country. And they said this, they said, sadly, however, your nation's history reveals that any significant progress toward racial justice or correction, racial equality has invariably been met by countervailing processes, overt or covert, that serves to undermine the advances achieved and to reconstitute the forces of oppression by other means. So to have a better understanding, because understanding is part of the healing process, I want to share with you why that is the case, why we make progress and then we have constant setbacks. And to do this, we just kind of cover the history, but I wanted to share a little bit about specifically an understanding of the current functioning of our criminal justice system. So as a reminder, the institution of our criminal justice system includes law enforcement, prosecution and defense lawyers, and our courts and prisons. To really have an understanding of what's happening and what's going on wrong with our criminal justice system, we have to kind of go back and understand how the system itself was formed from its inception. So it was formed and born out of a system of racism. And so I want to define what this is so that everybody is clear on it. So we're all essentially on the same page. And to do this, we're going to need to define racism itself. So racism is an oppressive system with the following three components. There's racial prejudice, legislative power, and enforcement of legislative power. So let's take briefly each one of these. So we look at racial prejudice. You know that this country was founded on this false ideology of white supremacy, which is this false ideology that whites are inherently superior, while people at the bottom which are Black people, are inherently inferior, right? And there's a gradation of people in between there. So that's what makes this system, or Black people in particular, targets for law enforcement, because this system has built into it anti-Blackness, right? So this is it's like the after effect of the illness of white supremacy. The after effect of it would be anti-Blackness. For this to be a system, of course, it has to be embedded in laws, legislative power. So historically, the whole system of slavery, which started with slavery, right? They had laws, right, enslaving Black people, and so law and the legislation legislation rather became something that was part of the criminalization of Black people. And then if you can have laws, you have to have a way of enforcing those laws. So we have laws in the books with the purpose of having laws when there's no way to enforce it. So what makes this a racist system is not only is it a target towards people of color, but there's not only there are laws, but there's an enforcement of those laws. And who historically has enforced those laws? right? It started off, as many of you may know, with slave patrols, which is the modern day, which is the precursor, rather, the modern day policing. So if, going back here, let me go back a little back. So when you want to look at what's actually happening and how racism plays itself out, one of the ways you can do that is to look at laws. What are the laws of a country and how are those laws being implemented and enforced? And so I wanted to share with you some of the laws, Supreme Court rulings that you may, many of you are aware of, but I want to share with you how these laws are racialized and how they promote a system of Black people being oppressed. So, and by the way, let me do this before I even talk about this, so it has more of an impact with you. So we know about mass incarceration, which began in the 70s and kind of spiked in the 90s, right? And you can see the spike, the curve is pretty much vertical. And so there's a spike, and then you see how America has made a system of incarcerating people. And then who are the people in these prisons? So primarily, the majority of them are people of color, right? You're Black and you're brown. So, and it's all done through the enforcement of laws. And so having this understanding will when we talk about reimagining law enforcement, then it's like it's easier to find solutions when you are clear on the problem, right? And the problems associated with some of these laws. So we know that stop and frisk, right, which was a decision that the Supreme Court made in 1968. And they ruled that it is not unconstitutional if there is reason to believe someone is armed and involved in a crime. Now, on the surface, someone's armed and involved in a crime, that would make sense that the police should be, getting involved in that, right? But on the surface, this sounds good. However, this tactic has been abused, particularly in our inner cities, which have become very racialized in terms of how policing is done, targeting people of color and so forth, because we privatized our prison system, right? People making a lot of money and are making basically crime a business. So the stop and frisk, you can pretty much do that in your inner cities, but if you try to do that in the suburbs and in Wall Street, it's not going to work too well, right? So you can if you just know the kind of what's happening and what's happened historically with this particular tactic, stop and frisk, it's been abused. One of the things I want to tell you about is the qualified immunity. I'll do this kind of briefly. Harlow versus Fitzgerald in 1982. And qualified immunity is one of the most aggressive and egregious legal errors in the history of the Supreme Court, in my opinion. Qualified immunity eviscerates accountability for law enforcement and allows officers to violate someone's constitutional rights, commit aggressive acts of violence, and to be able to get away with it using their badge as a get out of jail free card. Officers ultimately suffer the reputational loss when unprofessional officers commit misconduct. It breaks down public trust needed for law enforcement officers to do their jobs effectively. And to kind of make this make sense, just as a reminder, when you think about qualified immunity, in order for an officer to qualify for it, he must establish that there was a prior case that's been litigated and proven to have violated someone's constitutional rights. And if they can't establish that, then it doesn't work. They can't get away with it. So here's the definition of qualified immunity. I'll read it very briefly here. The Supreme Court drafted qualified immunity under the U.S. Code Section 1983. Qualified immunity grants immunity to government officials such as police officers performing discretionary functions, unless the plaintiff can show the official violated someone's clearly established constitutional or statutory rights for which a reasonable person should have known. And to make this make sense, the last time I spoke about this, I gave a couple examples, but I'll just share one example today. During a case that happened in 2019, Corbett versus Vickers. So in this case, what you had was Officer Vickers was chasing a suspect throughout a residential neighborhood. And this person, the suspect, ran into someone's backyard where they're having a family picnic of some sort. And the officer didn't know how this particular suspect was associated with the family. So when he ran to the backyard, he was able to get the suspect to comply, but he also proned everyone out on the ground, handcuffed the suspect, no problem, right? All is good. Unbeknownst to him, the family dog comes out named Bruce, and the officer, for some bizarre reason, from all accounts, the dog wasn't being threatening, but the officer, for some reason, started shooting at the dog, missing repeatedly, but striking a child. This is a few feet away from him in the back of the knee. So, of course, the mother sues for compensation for what has happened to her child. And remember, the burden of proof rests with the prosecution. In order for the officer to be held accountable, the plaintiff has to determine that there was a prior case, clearly established case, that can clearly violate someone's constitution or statutory rights. Well, because the plaintiff, the civil rights attorney in this case, was unable to find a case that actually had the same functional facts as the one that they dealt with, the officer was granted qualified immunity. And why couldn't they find a particular case? Because it was so bizarre and preposterous what that officer did that there wasn't even a case on the books. Therefore, the officer was granted qualified immunity. So you can see how bizarre this law is, right? Or this, actually, it's a legal doctrine, rather, right, that protects police officers, and it protects them even if they commit misconduct. So as you learn more about qualified immunity, you can see this is a law that needs to be taken off the books right now. There's a bill in the Senate right now where they're trying to do that, and hopefully they're able to. Another thing is pretext car stops. I don't know if any of you have seen a California vehicle code, but it's this thick. So it's literally impossible for you to drive a few miles down the road without committing a violation. If I was following you, I could find something because the book is just that thick. So pretext car stops, let's see, it was in 1996 under Wren versus the US. The Supreme Court ruled that pretext car stops are constitutional as long as the officer has probable cause, regardless of his motive. So what I want you to get out of this, I can't go into too much detail about some of the legal stuff here, but I just want you to get a sense of flavor for what I'm trying to share, is some of the laws on the books and some of the tactics used within law enforcement very much parallel what occurred during the era of slavery, right? During slave patrols, where people who were enforcing those unfair laws, from slave codes to Jim Crow laws, right? The enforcement of that, the same tactics still exist today. Now, I'm an unusual person, and I think in a sense, because I am actually, most officers like this blue wall of silence. Well, I'm not one of those people. Wrong is wrong. And I did my job for 26 years without violating anyone's constitutional rights. And as I've been following the George Floyd trial, and they've been interviewing different officers, I noticed that there's sort of this disconnect when they're interviewing Black police officers, commenting on things. They're very much on the side of justice and what is right. And ironically, at least the ones I saw being interviewed, the white officers it's a very interesting phenomenon because they're not standing by that. They're kind of, still hide behind that blue wall of silence and protecting their so-called brother. But that's not justice, right? Justice requires one to speak up when there's something not right. And I'm here to tell the whole nation and tell the whole world, if this is something that can get out to the whole world, that there's a big problem here in America. And I'm former law enforcement. I'm telling you that there's a big problem. There's a problem with our laws themselves and how these laws are being enforced. And one of the things that is important to do is also note the date on some of these, right? So we had, going back, let me kind of go back here. So we had the stop and frisk, right? Which was in 1968, so 70s, right? Then we had the qualified immunity kick in 1982, 1996 pretext car stops. But we look at that, all that coincides with this spike in crime, because in order to create a system where crime becomes a business, you need officers enforcing laws and keeping people in these prisons. So just a little bit of connection for you here, right? So we made a business out of that, and the laws are completely unfair and should not be on the books. And this is one of the reasons why there's this issue happening within our country. I want to talk to you briefly about, can't talk too much about this, but or in terms of our time together, but I want to talk about the Fourth Amendment, because a lot of you are figuring out, we're trying to figure out like the use of force, and this is a big topic within law enforcement. So one of the things most important to law enforcement, as I mentioned, and to you as well, is the use of force when officers make an arrest. So the Fourth Amendment regulates searches as it relates to an invasion of privacy, as one thing, and seizures come into two varieties, both property and your liberties. And so let's read the Fourth Amendment, then we'll kind of have a little further discussion about it. So the Fourth Amendment reads, the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrant shall issue but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. So when it comes to seizures, there are two types. One is relationship to property, like your property being seized, but the other relationship to your liberties. The Supreme Court has ruled that excessive force is an unreasonable seizure of your liberties. So I'm going to talk to you about, and this will be helpful as you kind of understand what's happening in the George Floyd trial and other cases of, you know, how the use of force is defended by law enforcement, right? And so in order to use deadly force, an officer or someone else must be in imminent danger of great bodily injury or death. And this comes from the Graham versus Connor case, which talk about the reasonableness factor of a particular use of force, which must be judged from the perspective of a reasonable officer on the scene rather than the 2020 vision of hindsight. The court outlined a non-exhaustive list of factors determining when an officer's use of force is objectively reasonable. When there's some factors here, the severity of the crime, whether the subject poses immediate threat to the safety of the officers or others, whether he is actively resisting arrest or attempting to evade arrest by flight. So these are some of the standards being used and so forth. But I also want to share with you how there's a term called exigent circumstances, where you literally as an officer can create the circumstances that you want to happen. And you can do it under the color of, the color of authority without actually being seemingly violating someone's rights. So you can see this in many cases that I see. There's one incident that occurred a few months back where an officer was stopping a car with two black teenagers inside of it. He attempts to stop the car, and then when he does so, he jumps out quickly and runs in front of the car. And as the teenagers kind of got spooked and scared, so they tried to drive off. And as they made the right turn, the officer shot and killed one of the kids inside the car. The reason why I'm mentioning this is because the officer created the exigent circumstances that occurred there, right? So just the fact that he ran in front of the car, right? Now, as they got spooked and tried to drive away, he was able to legally justify shooting them. So, and then he can fit some of these things in here. The severity of the crime, he assumed he thought the car was stolen, whether the suspect posed immediate threat to his safety, yeah, that would fit. Are they actively trying to get away? Yeah, that fits. So you can see how they can take the law and falsely apply it. And so we can talk further about this if there's time, but the term is called creating an exigent circumstance. So we're going to move now towards some of the more solution-based type things regarding all this. But I do want to say this, that the Sentencing Project, which is part of the United Nations, part of an organization out of the United Nations, and they said this about our criminal justice system, and they considered us as violating people's human rights here in the US, which was kind of kept quiet when they had their findings. But they said this: while the laws of the United States may be facially colorblind, a growing body of evidence shows that the individuals who apply such laws do not make cognitively colorblind decisions. As studies repeatedly demonstrate, the belief that the United States of the present is unaffected by the centuries of explicitly racist past, while perhaps well-intentioned, is at best wishful thinking and potentially blinds decision makers to the implicit racial bias that lingers in the American consciousness. So we can see that, but you can see how the history, I talked about the history earlier, how it's going to have an impact, right? We haven't gotten rid of this illness called racism because it's an ideology that we haven't overturned. And this has impacted our entire nation and every institution. But I want you to be aware that in a legal context, implicit bias is not recognized. So someone's motive is not acknowledged within our criminal justice system. Consider some of the things I talked about, right? The frisk, stop and frisk, right? Or the the fact that you can make pretext car stops, having a really bad motive, right, to target people, but that doesn't matter as long as you have probable cause. That is a reason to stop. They don't acknowledge the bad motive there. So moving forward to more of a solution base to all of this. And for some of you, that may have been difficult to kind of, navigate all the way through all of that I shared, but hopefully, you're able to follow me through that. But I wanted to talk about what I feel are 4 guiding principles that I think need to be implemented in a more intense way within our criminal justice system. First of all, we need to start over and redefine what is actually justice, because the way it is being defined today is not actual justice. So in my understanding, justice is when the interests of every individual and those of society are inextricably linked by standards that apply equally to all. Now, that sounds fairly straightforward and simple, but it's very profound in its impact if we were actually to apply this. And I'd like to give a kind of an example in relationship to this. When you think about a single cell in the human body, that single cell doesn't have any significance outside of the body that it's serving. It's only in serving the body, both serving and receiving, that actually has significance. So the body itself is constructed with this concept of justice, just as an example or as metaphors for us. So we need to see every individual as having equal value. All those individuals need to support it where they can too contribute to society, right? And both receive and serve this body of humanity. When we see segments of the population, for example, in our inner cities, which have historically been, ghettos have been constructed purposely by our government as places of oppression, right? Through systems of redlining. I mean, many of you know the history about all of that, right? And so it's an intentional construction, right? And this is where they're basically taking people from these inner cities and putting them in it's a revolving door back in and out of these prisons, right? Ripping and destroying families. And this has been happening, particularly in a more intense way since the early 70s. Inclusion, right? Acknowledgement of the oneness of mankind and the beauty of diversity. This is really, really important. When I think about why officers engage unprofessionally in misconduct, particularly when it comes to the use of force, I see 2 things happening there. One is poor training, absolutely poor training, not training enough under high stress situations. And what's really important is, and this is some of the recent shootings, I won't go into detail about those, and this is something that's troubled a lot of people. They say, well, how can an officer shoot someone that is unarmed? And here's what happens. And as an insider, I can tell you this. It's a lot. There's 2 things. When we talk about training, we're going to talk about another equally as important reason. Let's start with the training. So when you're making split-second decisions, you need to build a time lag into that. So for example, if I'm chasing a suspect that's armed with a gun or a knife or something like that, I need to keep my gun at what's called the low ready, in a downward position. And I cannot shoot anyone unless I can literally say I've identified the threat. And by doing this way, right? Let's say, and so let's follow along with me in this one. So let's say you're my partner, you're running with me, right? And so I want you to really kind of use your imagination and see what I'm doing here. So I'm chasing someone that's a violent person. Maybe they had a gun, maybe they have a knife. And I tell them, stop, drop the weapon, drop the knife, drop the gun, whatever it might be. As they turn around, then I'm lifting my gun up in a position where if I needed to use it, I could to defend myself or others, but I built that lag time in. And the reason why I'm kind of going into detail about this is because I want you to understand how it operates. So as I come up, I have now time to process that situation, right? And so then I can determine there's nothing in his hands. But however, let's kind of change the scenario. If I'm just pointing a gun at someone, happens repeatedly in these videos, I have no time to react. When I say drop the weapon and they turn around, I don't have time to process. So what happens is the officers are just shooting. So there's no time. So some of this is training under high stress situations. In my past, I was a defensive tactics instructor, so I know I can see. I said, "Oh, look, this is not good." So there's a lot of training that under high stress situations that has to take place. Number two, there has to be a fundamental regard for the sanctity of life. You have to believe that the people you're serving are equal to you and they're part of your extension of your family. This belief essentially in the oneness of mankind, right? Which eliminates all forms of prejudice from your conscious and subconscious mind. So if you're doing your job with this sense of your sanctity for life and respect for life, and that a belief that we're all essentially part of one family, and some family members may go astray, but doesn't mean they need to die for it, right? And so having this belief, right, what is a counter to belief. It's a counter. It's like we have, right, we're in a pandemic, right? And you have, what is the vaccine to racism? What is the vaccine to this false ideology in white supremacy, right? That whites are superior and blacks are inferior. What's the vaccine? That the vaccine would be an opposite, more powerful truth in the oneness of humanity. That would be what would counter this bias, as the Sentencing Project identified, implicit bias. So there needs to be two things within law enforcement. One is better training under high stress situations, as well as addressing the implicit bias issue that's within our country. Number three, trust. Firm belief in the reliability, integrity, truth, or strength of someone or something for which the stability of every human affair depends. So in order for an officer to do their job effectively, they have to have the trust of the community. And when they do polls, and these polls are very telling. So when they poll the majority of African Americans in this country, and they say, do you trust law enforcement? Do you think they're there to protect and serve you?
I don't trust them, but I'm white.
The majority of them say no. They have asked the same question to white people, and they say, yes, wow, they're there to protect and serve us. So there's this disconnect. So we clearly have two different criminal justice systems in our country. Now, in order, again, for an officer to effectively do their job, they must have the trust of the community, right? So the public trust is a critical key thing, and that is clearly broken right now. So we time later, we can talk further about how do you rebuild trust. Well, actually, how do you build trust? Because I don't think it was ever established between the African American communities in this country. Collaboration, working jointly to produce positive outcomes that benefits everyone, right? Working together, right? This idea that there's not there's not a disconnect between the officers and the community they're serving, right? Right now, there's a sense of us and them. This police are sort of othering their own community, right? You can imagine the impact of that as well. So it needs to be this understanding that there's a cooperative relationship between the police and the community that they serve. reimagine our criminal justice system. I'll say this, only a couple more slides to go and I'll be done, open it up for Q&A. This is very important. It comes from a statement prepared by the Baha'i International Community, which is a Baha'i affiliated organization out of the United Nations. And they said that present day conceptions of what is natural and appropriate in relationships among human beings themselves, between human beings and nature, between the individual and society, and between the members of society and its institutions, reflect levels of understanding arrived at by the human race during earlier and less mature stages in its development. If humanity is indeed coming of age, if all the inhabitants of the planet constitute a single people, if justice is to be the ruling principle of social organization, then existing conceptions that were born out of ignorance of these emerging realities have to be recast. Okay, so now this is kind of a common sense thing here, right? So if we have built all of our institutions, not some or a few, all of our institutions out of this false ideology of white supremacy, right? That the belief that whites are superior to blacks, and you know, if this is how we built, then it wouldn't make sense that we'd have to then reimagine with the correct ideology that we're one people. We'd have to then reimagine our entire society in the United States, right? We'd have to reimagine the whole thing. So I don't believe that you can put, as this old saying goes, you can put new wine in old bottles. We have to redo the whole thing. That's a kind of a bold thing to say, but I strongly feel that way. Education is the key. Instead of making, crime a business, how about we reduce crime through education? One thing remains to be said, is, as this quote indicates, it is that the communities are day and night occupied in making penal laws and in preparing and organizing instruments and means of punishment. They build prisons, make chains and fetters, arrange places of exile and banishment, and different kinds of hardships and tortures, and think by these means to discipline criminals, whereas in reality, they are causing destruction of morals and perversion of characters. The community, on the contrary, ought day and night to strive and endeavor with the utmost zeal and effort to accomplish the education of men and women, of course, to cause them day and night to progress and to increase in science and knowledge, to acquire virtues, to gain good morals and avoid vices, so that crimes may not occur in the first place. So the easiest way out of poverty, the easiest way out of our criminal justice system and crime is through education. I don't think any of you would argue with that point. So we need to, instead of investing all this millions of dollars into a criminal justice system, invest it, excuse me, into education. I want to play for you a short video. And one of the reasons why I like to share that is because we, as part of reimagining law enforcement, we need to also reimagine, in that process, we need to think about how law enforcement will be better suited when we're not doing certain things, right? Just like, we shouldn't have been transporting people that had medical issues, right, in the back of our patrol cars. How we handle people with mental health issues, and there's many. Should we be stopping people for administrative violations or, a registration problem or something like that? There's many things that we probably shouldn't be doing that we are currently doing. And so we have a very antiquated system that's very racially based that needs to be reimagined in so many different ways. So right now with our Q&A, I'm going to turn it over to Hoda to guide us through this part of it.
Well, thank you very, very much, Bob, for sharing your insider viewpoint and very coherent, very comprehensive, and within a very short time. I really want to thank you for your monologue earlier on. Thank you very much, Bob. And I personally am I want to translate that monologue into Farsi, so have it available so that, because you in a few minutes, you share the painful history of treatment of people of African descent up until now through its laws. And I think everybody should know all across the world, because everybody's looking to America. So I really, really thank you for doing this. One of the, we asked a few people to, if they could just think of questions ahead of time. And I'm just going to read off a few. A person says that it is known that Derek Chauvin, his foot was on the neck of George Floyd so long that he actually had lost his pulse 2 minutes before he actually took his foot off of George Floyd's neck. And that itself is a very, very powerful fact. And so I just wanted to know, he knew people were videoing it. He's a police officer there to serve and protect the community he is serving. He knows he's being videotaped, and he's asked by several people to please have mercy on this individual. And he continues to exercise madness, putting his foot on the neck of George Floyd while he's screaming, "I can't breathe." I'd like to know, the question is, and there's several questions that are connected. What are additional steps that can be taken to increase police accountability for misconduct?
Yeah.
So that's the first question.
Okay, so accountability is the number one urgent matter within law enforcement because of what you can see, right, in terms of the use of force. And so one of the things that needs to happen is and I'm glad it's on the books now, to get rid of qualified immunity. So officers, are held accountable. And one of the thoughts that came to mind, and I've heard this from other people as well, is having officers carry their own insurance. So right now, every city or county will back their officers, right, and have them. Basically, the city or the county actually pays any kind of misconduct. But imagine, an officer having the responsibility where there's no qualified immunity they can hide behind, and they're responsible for having their own insurance. And if there's a number of complaints, there's a number, and they get, and if you can't do the job, you don't have insurance, right? And so having that, put in place where there's accountability by removal of certain unfair tactics and laws and doctrines that protect officers. Right now you have, for example, police unions, right, that advocate and lobby for more leniency with their local, and state governments to protect them, protect their officers who violate and engage in misconduct. So police unions, that has to be addressed as well. The issues, and police unions, people may or may not know, are very powerful unions with lots and lots of money that support laws in the books. That's support laws that grant them leniency when officers do engage in misconduct. So that has to take place. Also, the every reported misconduct for any agency is done through what's called an internal affairs department. So if you come in as a citizen and complain about an officer's misconduct, by law, the internal affairs department division has to investigate that, right, and basically enforce whatever the appropriate discipline would be. But many of you are picked up on this. What is the problem with this issue? You have police policing the police. Is that really working? I suggest we have a citizen review board, right? Where it's an objective board of citizens that aren't police officers that can look more objectively at the situation. I mean, we're all friends in police departments. They break bread together. They're all buddies. So how can someone think objectively? I'm not saying that it's this way in every department. So I want to generalize in that context. But certainly, there needs to be a different level of accountability that's very much objective. And that's very, very important. The other thing in regards to your question is, it's all about, officers in terms of the training, you know, going back to that, but the training has to really embrace this concept that we are one people. That has to be a thing that's really outside of not just law enforcement. So I know that there are levels of bias, you know, implicit bias training that's out there and so forth. The other thing too that relates to this is we have to remove this whole notion of making crime a business. You know, many of you know about the prison industrial complex, right? Where the prison system and businesses have merged together, and private businesses are basically having quotas in the books that says each state, each area must have a certain quota or number of prisoners in their prisons. Otherwise, otherwise the state has to pay that private, you know, prison company. And so we made a business, and they're lobbying for, you know, for laws that keep people in prison, and you can see the problem there. So, I mean, there's a lot to, you know, say with your question, Hoda, but those are just some of the few reflections that I had.
A second question that was come up was referring to, like, for example, Dante Wright, the 16-year-old young guy that was just shot, and it was recorded that his hands were actually up when he was shot by one bullet. So as a ordinary American citizen, what should I do if I see police using what appears to be excessive force, for example, during an arrest?
Okay. That's a great question. I will say right away that you do not want to physically get involved, because you yourself would be committing a crime and could be subject to being hurt very severely or even killed. There's laws in the books about, you know, that. But certainly, if we go back to the George Floyd incident, right? It was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen, where a person is pleading for their life, and people didn't just callously walk by and say, well, that's his problem. They stopped, and they did what? Yeah. So that's really important. And I think that's one of the best witnesses, right? Because it's an objective witness. There's no bias there. So that is very, very important. So those two factors, not personally getting involved and also recording and sticking around and to be a witness. If you just do something and then you leave, you want to make sure that you're able to, as the MMA fighter, I forget what's his name here. I wrote it down. Donald Williams, right? So I think he's one of the ones that recalled the police department and said, I think I just witnessed a murder. And so taking an active step, because the thing about justice requires an action. It's one thing if you say, yeah, I'm a just person, but you don't act with justice, then are you truly a just person, right? That's the question, because justice requires an action. And so you are, if you think of this, as I mentioned, the idea of all of us being like single cells in a single body, we have to protect each other, look after each other. And that's what I saw in the George Floyd incident. The community looked after each other. There was an elderly black man, right, that stopped by, and they asked him on the stand, you know, why did you stop by? I was just being nosy. But what he was doing was just he's protecting the community by just being a witness. He even tried to encourage George Floyd to cooperate. And sadly, George Floyd said, I can't get up. How could I get in the car when I can't even get up? So, so next question.
Here's another question for you. And a lot of these questions are from everyday ordinary people like myself, or even immigrant Americans who come here and we're totally ignorant about the oppressive system of racial prejudice that has history, from the slave patrols, from the doctrine of white supremacy. And you just, in this session, you've only barely, and I really think, hopefully, maybe you will also repeat another a talk on the history of racism and how it's connected to why we have two policing systems, one for whites and one for blacks. What you said in your talk, you said, as you're watching the trial of Derek Chauvin, who killed the innocent man, George Floyd, and everybody witnessed it, you said that the white officers are hiding behind the blue wall of silence, and that the African-American police officers, they are being just. And you said this is a big problem, and you said that clearly in this talk. So the question is, if this oppressive system needs this component of racial prejudice as a base, what can be done to address this implicit bias in police officers?
It's a deeper societal issue, right? So, law enforcement is just a cross section of society. So we have this issue embedded in every institution. Now, the difference is law enforcement officers have been given this great power. We have the greatest power in the nation. And the reason I say this is we have the power to take your life, right? That's a great power, which means that we cannot afford to make mistakes. There's, as I heard someone else say, there's certain professions, surgeons, right? They can't afford to make mistakes, can they? Pilots, they can't afford to make mistakes. And certainly law enforcement is in the same boat. And so the idea of, I think it goes back to, and that's why I love doing the history, or talking about the history, is because this whole country was founded on this false ideology of white supremacy, which again, I want to clarify, means, at the heart of it means it's a system of white supremacy, right? Which creates feelings of anti-Blackness, and results in that. And so that is something that if that's never addressed, then we're never going to address the root cause of the issue. That's why racism, we can have amendments, we can change laws, we can change tactics, we can do all these different things, and we're still going to have the problem. So what we need is as I mentioned earlier, the antidote, right, to this, which is the opposite ideology, which is the correct one, that we are in fact one people. Like this idea of oneness has to be something that's taught from childhood through all our institutions. And so I'll share with the group, what I'm planning on doing is going back and working with my law enforcement brothers and sisters on the history of law enforcement, and also addressing this implicit bias issue. But they have to understand it's all connected to the history. So through education, so that is the key to this whole thing, is through the process of education. And we need to kind of figure out different and various ways in which we can provide the proper education for different institutions. I have ideas about, what the specific kind of education needs to happen for law enforcement, which is going to be tailored to them. And embedded in there is going to be a real understanding of the history of this thing. And as a general comment, I wanted to say this: we've never reckoned with the issue of race in this country. Truly reckoned with it. And I look at racism as a pig. And what we've done, we put makeup on the pig. But guess what? With all this makeup, it's still what? It's still a pig. So we have to reimagine a different society, right? We can't pretty this thing up, right? We have to redesign all of our institutions, reimagine that. And I will say this about reimagining our institutions. It's not that me and other officers just sit around and figure out how we're going to do this. What we need in a true system of justice is we need the community to say, what kind of policing system would you like? And let's implement that. So it needs to be, that's the word collaboration. It needs to occur in that mutual context.
And this is one of the last questions that was formatted and passed on to me to ask. What are specific things that you can think of that white passing people such as myself, ordinary citizens, people like us that are on this Zoom right now, what can we do to make a change in the system, to make it more just? I heard last night, the night before last actually, an African-American gentleman who's very active in this work. He said, we cannot win this battle. With tears rolling down his cheeks and his voice cracking, he says, we cannot win this battle, this fight, without you. Will you do your part? We need you. Without the allies, Black men will continue to die. Black men like him and Black men like you said earlier, Bob. Is there anything specific that we can do to highlight, to do the supreme effort that is needed to help in creating justice in the criminal justice system? Is there anything we can do?
Yes, but before I share some of my reflections on that, I will say that our white allies have always been there with us. When I think back on slavery, the abolitionists, right? When I think of the 60s, right? And you see beautiful pictures of shoulder to shoulder, hand in hand, and the sit-ins weren't just Black people. White people have always been there with us. What we need is a larger, and so everyone here, every white person here, I know you're our allies, you're the ally of Black people. What we need is a larger, significant body of the nation. It's all about numbers. It's all about numbers. And specifically to addressing issues of, how can you specifically help as a white person? I think that one of the biggest things is when I love this, what comes to mind is the George Floyd incident, right? Where I think she was, I think a paramedic, she worked in the fire department, and she was pleading for them. I'm a paramedic, I'm a firefighter, I don't see a pulse, let me help, let me help. I was almost in tears watching that. She's an ally, right? And so you've always been with us. And I think, I think, so I want to just acknowledge that. And the other thing too is everyone needs to be more emboldened, because although you're allies here, I think there's different levels of your sense of justice, right? There's different levels of it. Justice requires courage. It requires absolute courage. And I want to, in light of this idea of justice requiring courage, I wrote, I like to write. And so I wrote a poem called Justice. And I want to share it with you. It relates to what you said. So it starts this way. It says, I want to tell you about a man who was the very embodiment of the word justice. He was born in Persia in 1844 and became a religious prisoner alongside his father at the tender age of 8. His only crime was to believe all religions and mankind were one. His spirit was tested by the fire of injustice and privation for 56 years. He bore it all without bitterness or hate. He arrived in America in 1912 at the height of Jim Crow. He wanted to know firsthand, what was the situation between the Blacks and the whites? He quickly discovered the situation was quite grim and much work needed to be done. To a Black child in the presence of whites, he held up a piece of dark chocolate, held it close to the child's skin and smiled. He taught us in that brief moment, sweetness is in the content of our character and is not in our hue. At a white segregated luncheon, they attempted to exclude one of his Black friends. He would have none of that. He placed his Black friend at the head of the table. a symbol of the highest honor. To the shock and dismay of their social mores, he cared not. In one stroke, he told us injustice should not be tolerated, and that injustice should not be tolerated, and that justice requires courage and is unapologetic. He taught us justice is linked to our unity and our oneness. This gospel is preached in homes, churches, synagogues, colleges, and at every turn. He shattered the false ideology of white supremacy. He told us his father once compared blacks to the people of the eye surrounded by the white. He flipped this whole racial script on its head. Before he left our shores, he gave us both a promise and a warning. He promised America would someday lead the world spiritually. He warned, however, that unless and until justice is made a reality between the blacks and the whites, blood would flow in our streets. This man is none other than Abdu'l-Baha, the most prominent figure to ever step foot on our shores. If you want to know who is Abdu'l-Baha, simply ask one of your fellow Baha'i friends. So the message I wanted to convey there is justice requires courage and is unapologetic. And walk boldly, my dear allies. And when you see an unjust situation, say something, do something. Do not cower away. As I said, was it Friday? I said, this whole thing is like a boxing ring. And Black people were in this ring fighting racism. And we're taking quite a pummeling. And we need you not to just sit there and encourage us to stand strong, but get in the ring with us. I need a little spiritual healing. So I'm going to turn to Eugenia. And Eugenia, I said this earlier, if you can take yourself off mute and sing me back into a cheery mood.
We love you, Bob.
Thank you. Love you too, brother. So Eugenia, you're on mute. I need your voice.
Love you too.
Thank you, Bob. Bless you. Sending you big hugs, yeah? Didn't he wake you up this morning? Didn't he start you on your way? Or haven't he kept you from falling? Didn't he brighten your dark days? When you look around and see all the beauty that life could be, just think of his goodness. Think of his goodness. Think of his goodness. Hasn't God been good? Didn't he wake you up this morning? Didn't he start you on your way? Or haven't he kept you from falling? Didn't he brighten your dark days? When you look around and see all the beauty that life could be, just think of his goodness. Think of his goodness. Think of his goodness. Hasn't God been good to you?
Thank you, Eugenia. And then to my White ally, Hoda, I need your voice too. We need your voice as well.
For a prayer,
But that's the song you sang on Friday.
I would be happy to. If you desire with all your heart friendship with every race on earth, your thoughts, spiritual and positive, will spread. It will become the desire of others, growing stronger and stronger until it reaches the minds of all men. If you desire with all your heart friendship with every race on earth, your thoughts, spiritual and positive, will spread. Oh Lord, let it spread. It will become the desire of others, growing stronger and stronger until it reaches the minds of all men. Abdul Baha.
Jeannie and Hoda, thank you so much. So Hassan, can we take everyone off mute? And or rather, let's do it this way. I want people to be allowed to make comments or share or ask questions. So maybe unmute yourself, and then after you're done, make your comments or questions, and you can mute yourself back so we don't get any feedback. So feel free to do that. And Hassan, I can't see everyone, so if you wanted to coordinate who wants to speak first, I'll let you handle that.
Excellent. Thank you so much. First of all, before we get to the questions, want to really appreciate you, dear Bob. What a splendid talk. What a gift you are, and unique you are in your service and sharing your heart, your soul. Really want to thank you.
Oh, yes, hold on. Oh, sorry.
Oh, love you, Hattie. No, it was beautiful. It was truly wonderful to have you, dear Bob, here. And just want to thank everyone for being here with us today. Want to thank Hoda. Want to thank Barbara Talley as a member of the Iranian Baha'is for Racial Justice. Want to thank everyone that's been representing. Want to really thank you for your talk today and all the people that have contributed questions. At this time, dear Bob, we're going to stop the recording, but we'll continue the live Facebook Live. So any of the friends that have any questions, it will.
And that's on, before we go on further, I want to give Barbara an opportunity to share first if she can do that.
Please, please.
Oh, thank you. I did, and wonderful as always, and to everyone here, and especially Huda with her heart, and Baha'u'llah says to strive to translate that which hath been written into reality and action, and you've given us an action plan, which is good. That we need to. You've given us specific things that we need. I had a question though, from your perspective, what percentage of the police departments are white supremacists? I mean, is it just some old leadership paradigms and racism built into the system, but there's a lot of good people that just need to be reached, or is it just really is the system just so? And I know we need to change the system because of the laws, but are the people there in the majority inherently good, or is it people just have come into the system because it does give them an opportunity to play white hero and have the power of life and death in their hands?
Wonderful question. And the simple answer is, there's not really simple answers to that necessarily, but it's all of that. What you said, It's all of that. So okay, here's the thing about power. Like I said, police have one of the most, we've been given, I mean, I'm retired now, but officers have been given this great power, the power to shoot, no shoot, take a life or don't take a life. I mean, that's a lot of power there. And what happens with power, it reveals your character. There's been in so many situations where I would have been justified in taking someone's life. I remember this one young, how old was he? He was 15 or 16-year-old black kid had robbed a liquor store with what I didn't know at the time was a fake gun. So I'm chasing him down the corridor, the same situation as the 13-year-old the other day in Chicago, same scenario. And I'm yelling at him, stop, drop the gun, drop the gun. And he spins around, and I see that at the same time the gun is fallen from his hand, and he's doing it was the same scenario. But because I had this real profound understanding and love for humanity, I did not shoot this kid. Now that may sound a simple point, right? But do you know, it took several years before the comments went away that Bob's a coward. He should have shot this kid. Why didn't he shoot him? And so you have to fundamentally go into law enforcement with this basic fundamental respect and honor for the sanctity of someone's life, because you've been given this great power. And so, yeah, there's people who come into it because they know they're going to be getting, you'd be able to use their racist ideology and be able to, do their thing under the color of authority, essentially, right? And there's all kinds, and that's why I mentioned this concept earlier, but called exigent circumstance, where an officer can create a situation. I played this video on Friday during one of the Zoom sessions where there was a 60-year-old black man driving. He's been stopped by a white officer named Gene Bell. He used to play football in Michigan, or good guy. So he's being stopped for just a simple traffic violation. And you hear the officer's camera comes on way before he pulls him over, and he's calling them a bad name and an effing idiot before he even pulls him over, a white cop. He gets there, and now there's this unprofessional interaction between the officer and Gene Bell. And he says, Gene Bell says, "Can you just tell me why you stopped me?" And the officer says, "Give me your driver's license, registration, and insurance." And Gene, can you just, and he goes back, can you tell me why you stopped? So now there's the battle of wills in place. So there's this back and forth. He's just wanting to know why he was stopped. Second officer comes over and calls them, and of course, and the first officer says, "He's not giving me his information. I think I want to arrest him." And he tells him he lied to me, or didn't tell me he's not giving me his ID, and it's been 15 times, which wasn't the truth. And so the second officer turns to him, Gene Bell, and calls him a boy, and he's like in his 20s, and yanks him out of the car, and the fight's on. He ends up, Gene Bell ends up getting injured. Okay, so just to fast forward that to get to my point, that was all created. That was called exigent circumstance. All you have to do, you could avoid that whole thing by acting like a professional. Now, is the officer legally justified in doing what he did? Yes. Right? It may sound strange, but there's no rules about that. Rules of engagement. You can either tell someone or not tell someone. It's called respect for the sanctity of life. Therefore, I'm going to tell you why I stopped you. I think it borders on the Fourth Amendment. You're going to stop someone, you should minimally tell them why you stop them. But because but the officer created those situations. Situations can be avoided if you have a heart. Now, the badge sits over your heart. To enforce justice requires heart, not just the ability to enforce laws. So two things I'll say, and I'll kind of move on to other questions. So we have officers don't know their history. They don't know that they're part of a larger system. And so you can step into the system and you can start enforcing laws. I mean, I made a lot of drug arrests that in hindsight, I wish I wasn't following the enforcement of those laws. You don't realize this person for this particular drug maybe go away for 10 years or 25 years. And I enforced those laws. I'm being honest with you. I look back with great regret. So, and I have love for humanity in my heart. So the system itself, can perpetuate an injustice. The system itself is messed up, honestly. And I'm saying that I'm saying that because I'm telling the truth. And then these other folks who are coming in with taking the power and abusing the power, there needs to be a better hiring process in place for those folks. That's a much needed thing. So Barbara, I can probably talk on and on, but your question is very, very good. It's a lot to unpack there. I kind of said probably, enough at this point. But thank you, Barbara, for making your comments. You want to say anything else, Barbara?
Yeah, I would like, what could you say to give us hope right now? Because systems, if you got to tear down a system and rebuild it, even a house would take a long time. And you'd have to have the people in the house willing to do that. What can you say to people of color right now to give us hope so we're not afraid, so that we don't give up hope? We know we just had a letter recently that in a state of hopelessness, we do things we wouldn't do if we had hope. What can you say to give us hope right now? Just like we can say one day we're going to have that, but we don't know if we'll make it to that one day. Today, what can give us hope from your perspective?
Beautiful question. We have, I know that you're familiar with, there's an organization called, I just recently joined, they're the National Association for African American Police Officers. I talked to someone the other day, he's in one of the chapters in another state, and it was like talking to myself. And so one of the things that's hopeful is I really believe that it's going to be your Black officers that are going to lead the way. And because I'm part of the organization, I want to add my ideas, contribute to that. But the hope is that you have Black officers that can see what you see. That may sound funny to me to say it that way, but a lot of my coworkers, who aren't African American, I ask them about to kind of get their pulse of the George Floyd thing, and the majority of them are think about racism, as you know, Barbara, very well. It distorts your vision. There's a distortion, so you can't see the same set of facts someone else can see who doesn't have that distorted vision. So the hope is that there are mobilization, and it's of African American officers that are going to be implementing some things and asking for change in a way that you haven't seen before. So taking the wheel is going to be African Americans, is my hope, on driving this thing, driving our criminal justice system in the right direction. We have eyes on now.
Well, with pupils of the eye in charge or leading the way, or the hope of that gives me hope. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Okay, Hassan, I'll let you coordinate.
Well, thank you so much, Bob. That was great questions between you and Barbara and Hoda. Really appreciate that. At this time, I'm going to stop the recording.